a little bit about Pasco. It is one of the Tri-Cities in southeastern Washington, along with its neighbors, Richland and Kennewick. So that's right along the Columbia River Valley. So you have a lot of agriculture. Obviously, you have the river that divides Pasco from its neighboring cities. And then another big employment generator is the Hanford site up to the northwest of Pasco, which generates a lot of jobs and activity crossing the river and traveling over to this employment center. So previously, Pasco didn't have any long-range transportation planning documents, which was really starting to become a problem for them. Over the last 20 years or so, they've had a lot of housing growth and a lot of very suburban development styles, which has led to a lot of issues with their transportation system, and particularly access to the other Tri-Cities, access within and around Pasco. So you have these kind of compounding problems of large population growth, large growth on the river bridges, and just kind of that was creating a whole bunch of issues. So they brought us in to help look at solutions to their transportation issues. So typically on our long range plans, we would collect some counts to give us kind of this limited snapshot. In Pasco, we were lucky enough to collect our counts in January this year. So we still had traffic counts, and we looked at approximately 50 locations. But even that, as you can see, the coverage was pretty limited to our key arterial corridors and how people get on and off the freeway. So it's not necessarily providing us a comprehensive picture. And then from that, typically we would do some intersection analysis using Synchro to identify our needs and see what projects are needed to support growth in Pasco's transportation system. So we were actually able to supplement that using StreetLight Data in Pasco to kind of dig into some issues that we typically wouldn't be able to address as part of our planning. So the additional analyses that we looked at, we were able to look at employment commute patterns. We were also able to see how different people use the interchanges in the city, where freight travels to, how the bridges are being used by residents of the Tri-Cities, and then also where bicycles travel to and from in Pasco. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those analyses. So this is the zone structure that we set up for the Tri-Cities. We were able to capture kind of more like the regional trips in the city, and then also drill down into the different residential areas of Pasco. We pulled out the airport, a major community college, a lot of the more industrial areas, and then also some of the big employment zones that we expected. So the first analysis was our commute patterns analysis. This was just doing a pretty basic OD analysis with trip characteristics. So we were able to screen out home-based work trips. And we looked at AM peak trips to really capture what would be our traditional commute trips. And we looked between 5 and 10 a.m. because one of the issues that we were running into is the Hanford site generates a lot of employment trips, has some shift work. So we wanted to make sure that we could capture those shift changes. So really what you see here is that perhaps unsurprisingly, Pasco, being more of a bedroom community for the Tri-Cities, doesn't really have a lot of employment trips outside of its downtown area. What really surprised me was how popular some of the industrial uses and businesses were for employment centers in Pasco. And then also that we didn't see as much employment as you might expect along Road 68, which is kind of this other commercial corridor. It has a lot of businesses and restaurants, which I would have expected to see maybe more employment there. And that just really didn't pan out in our analysis. One of the other things that really surprised me, which took some coordination with StreetLight, was kind of this zone where there's a high school. We were having more than expected home-based work trips, and we couldn't really figure it out because it's largely residential. And then after drilling down into it, we determined it was likely due to the high school that's there. And so students come in, spend the day there, and then go home, and that's classified as their work. So that was one of the really interesting things. But more importantly, we were also able to see where trips go to in the region and how they're getting there to really help understand these more broader regional travel patterns that we wouldn't necessarily answer as part of a typical transportation system plan. We were also able to do that looking at freight travel patterns. Again, you see a lot of freight activity in the eastern and downtown Pasco. And interestingly, this also correlates into the traffic on the bridges, where you have a lot of heavy vehicles traveling on the US 12 bridge. So WashDOT maintains a network of permanent count stations on the 182 and 395 bridges, which we are able to use to generate these AADT estimates for freight vehicles and estimate what our heavy vehicle percentage would be. So that's how we got those numbers. And that was really surprising to see because it's very heavy on the heavy vehicle side, which makes sense given the amount of industry that's over there, but it was still good to know. And one of the other main things that came out of this was we were able to see what popular local streets freight vehicles came into and out of the highway system on. And so we did that using a top routes analysis. And as part of that, we are able to see what popular local routes are. So that way, when we are planning for our priority bike network, we can really make sure that on those routes where we have a lot of heavy vehicle traffic, we can better accommodate and make it safe for potential cyclists so that they really feel comfortable out there. We were also able to look at bike patterns in the area. We went through a couple iterations as we were doing this analysis using different years of data. And it was really cool to see how the different StreetLight metrics changed over time. And so like the new processing metrics really helped to identify a lot more bike patterns than we had when we looked at the 2018 bike data. So a couple key things, we were really able to see the path along the Columbia River that really gets a lot of use, which makes sense. And when we drilled down into the trip patterns of cyclists, we were able to see that a lot of those trips ended up being longer distance in excess of 10 miles. So it really identified that these are more kind of your recreational cyclists who are coming out there, enjoying the day, seeing some of the Tri-Cities, and then returning home. One of the other interesting findings was seeing a lot of cyclist trips popping up around Road 68, and then also on some of the roads that lead to and from that. And this was tended to be a lot shorter trips. And so we really think that that's people or perhaps kids from these neighborhoods who go to Road 68, watch a movie, go to a restaurant, see their friends, and then go back home to these residential neighborhoods. And so that was really cool to be able to recognize those patterns, because then we can better accommodate those when we're looking at what do we want to do for bike infrastructure in an area that doesn't really have anything today. So kind of some lessons learned. This was my first StreetLight project, and it really helped having a game plan for questions that we wanted to answer and things we wanted to look at with the city. It was also helpful to have the city be there to provide input on these results, to see when we needed to keep looking a little bit deeper to see what might pop out. But overall, I think one of the benefits of using StreetLight or this big data is that it's very easy to test things out in different analyses and see what makes sense. And maybe you have to tweak it a little bit to get a slightly different result, but that, it's not a hard issue as opposed to in the more typical planning process where you have this limited snapshot and that's kind of your picture of the system. This really enables us to look more broadly and see what you might miss otherwise.